Hello, third and fourth graders. Today, I'm not only going to read to you a chapter of the Phantom Tollbooth, but I'm also going to read to you a story from our Bible storybook. Because this is one of my favorite stories. Aren't they all, though? I say that about every story. Really, though, I love this one. I'm going to read it to you. I'm also going to ask you the questions in the back afterwards, so be listening carefully to see if you can answer those. This is called Elijah and the Prophets of Baal. Because Elijah knew God had sent him to speak to the king, he was not afraid. At once, King Ahab asked, "Are you the man who has been causing all this trouble?" Elijah answered, "No, I am not the man who has troubled your country. You and your family are the guilty ones. You have forsaken the Lord God and disobeyed his commandments. You have worshipped the idols of Baal. This is what has caused all this trouble. Now, have the people of Israel and Jezebel's prophets of Baal meet me at Mount Carmel." This was one time the king did not give orders. Instead, he did just as Elijah commanded. When the crowd of curious people gathered at Mount Carmel, they saw Elijah for the first time in 3 years. They listened quietly while he spoke to them. "How long are you going to serve first one God and then another?" he asked. "If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is true God, then choose him." Elijah did not ask the people to choose right then. Instead, he wanted to prove to them who was the true God. He said, "I and the prophets of Baal have met with you here. I am only one man, but there are 450 prophets of Baal. Bring 2 bulls for sacrifices. We will build 2 altars and lay a bull on each altar. The heathen can call on their God, and I will call on the Lord God. Let the one who answers by fire be your God." The people liked this plan. Quickly, they brought the offerings for sacrifices. What will happen next? They wondered. Elijah told the prophets of Baal to choose the bull they wanted, and he took the one that was left. He said, "Since there are so many of you, you offer your sacrifice first and call on your God. Ask him to send fire." In a short time, the heathen prophets had their sacrifice ready. From morning until noon, they prayed, "Oh, Baal, hear us!" But there was no answer. They jumped up and down around the altar. Still, nothing happened. Elijah knew their God could not send fire from heaven. At noon, he made fun of them, saying, "Cry louder! Maybe he is talking or going on a trip. Perhaps he's sleeping and can't hear you." The prophets cried even louder. They cut themselves with knives so Baal would feel sorry for them and answer their prayer. Still, Baal did not answer, and no fire fell from the sky. When it was time for the evening sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem, Elijah told all the people to gather around him. As they watched, he rebuilt the altar of the Lord that had once stood on this spot. He chose 12 rough stones and piled them together for the altar. Then he dug a ditch around it. On top of the altar, he placed the wood. Elijah wanted to make sure the people would realize God's great power. He commanded, "Bring 4 barrels of water and pour them on the sacrifice and wood." When this was done, he said to them, "Do it a second time." A third time, he said, "Do it again." 12 barrels of water had been poured on the altar. The wood and meat were drenched. The water filled the trench up to the brim. When everything was ready, Elijah said, "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God, and that I am your servant, that I have done this to obey you. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that these people may know you are the Lord God, and return to worship you." At once, fire fell from the sky and burned up the sacrifice and the wood. Even all the water in the ditch was licked up by fire. How amazed the people were. They had never seen anything like this before. Now they were sure Elijah's God was the true God. They fell on their faces and cried, "The Lord, he is God! The Lord, he is God!" Making sure they would not be tempted to worship Baal again, the people killed all the sinful heathen prophets. All right, why did Elijah want to meet the prophets of Baal? What do you think? Maybe you can tell a parent or somebody around you what the answer is. And the next question is, how did Elijah prove to all the people that the Lord is God? All right, we're going to move on to our story. First, I need a drink of coffee. Coffee just tastes so much better out of a Michigan mug. You know what I mean? Yeah, I think you do. All right, well, here's Socks. She's here. She has been really just doing a whole lot of nothing. She takes a lot of naps. It's like all she wants to do is take a nap. But I brought her here today so that she could say hi to Wyatt and to Tumbles and hang out with them a little bit. When I came into the classroom, she was in the sink, throwing herself a little pool party by herself. Ugh, Socks, what are we going to do with you? I don't know. But what we are going to do is get into our next chapter. Chapter 7. The royal banquet. Okay, yes, sucks. You can see the picture. My goodness, here we go. Right this way. Follow us. Come along. Step lively. Here we go, they shouted, hopping from the wagon and bounding up the broad marble stairway. Milo and Tok followed closely behind. It was a strange-looking palace, and if he didn't know better, he would have said that it looked exactly like an enormous book, standing on end, with its front door in the lower part of the binding, just where they usually place the publisher's name. Once inside, they hurried down a long hallway which glittered with crystal chandeliers and echoed with their footsteps. The walls and ceilings were covered with mirrors, whose reflections danced dizzily along with them, and the footmen bowed coldly. "We must be terribly late," gasped the Earl nervously, as they reached the tall doors of the banquet hall. It was a vast room full of people talking loudly and arguing. The long table was carefully set with gold plates and linen napkins. An attendant stood behind each chair, and at the center, raised slightly above the others, was a throne covered in crimson cloth. Directly behind on the wall was the royal coat of arms, flanked by the flags of Dictionopolis. Milo noticed many of the people he had seen in the marketplace. The letterman was busy explaining to an interested group the history of the W, and off in a corner, the humbug and the spelling bee were arguing fiercely about nothing at all. So here is the royal coat of arms. Can you tell what's right in the middle? What those letters are? A, E, I, O, and U. Officer Shrift wandered through the crowd, suspiciously muttering, "Guilty, guilty, they're all guilty." And on noticing Milo, brightened visibly and commented in passing, "Is it 6 million years already? My, how time flies." Everyone seemed quite grumpy at having to wait for lunch, and they were all relieved to see the tardy guests arrive. "Certainly glad you finally made it, old man," said the humbug, cordially pumping Milo's hand. "As guest of honor, you must choose the menu, of course." "Oh my," he thought, not knowing what to say. "Be quick about it," suggested the spelling bee. "I'm famished, F-A-M-I-S-H-E-D." As Milo tried to think, there was an ear-shattering blast of trumpets, entirely off-key, and a page announced to the startling guests, "King Azaz, the Unabridged!" The king strode through the door and over to the table and settled his great bulk onto the throne, calling irritably, "Places, everyone! Take your places!" He was the largest man Milo had ever seen, with a great stomach, large piercing eyes, a gray beard that reached his waist, and a silver signet ring on his little finger of his left hand. He also wore a small crown and a robe with the letters of the alphabet beautifully embroidered all over it. "What have we here?" he said, staring down at Tok and Milo as everyone else took their place. "If you please," said Milo, "my name is Milo, and this is Tok. Thank you very much for inviting us to your banquet, and I think your palace is beautiful." "Exquisite," corrected the Duke. "Lovely," counseled the minister. "Handsome," recommended the Count. "Pretty," hinted the Earl. "Charming," submitted the Undersecretary. "Silence!" suggested the King. "Now, young man, what can you do to entertain us? Sing songs? Tell stories? Compose sonnets? Juggle plates? Do tumbling tricks? Which is it?" "I can't do any of those things," admitted Milo. "What an ordinary little boy," commented the King. "Why, my cabinet members can do all sorts of things. The Duke here can make mountains out of molehills. The minister splits hairs. The Count makes hay while the sun shines. The Earl leaves no stone unturned. And the Undersecretary," he finished ominously, "hangs by a thread. Can't you do anything at all?" "I can count to 1,000, offered Milo. "Ah, numbers! Never mention numbers here. Only use them when we only use them when we absolutely have to," growled Azaz, disgusted. "Now, why don't you and Tok come up here and sit next to me, and we'll have some dinner." "Are you ready with the menu?" reminded the humbug. Well," said Milo, remembering what his mother had always told him to eat lightly when he was a guest. "Why don't we have a light meal?" "A light meal it shall be," roared the bug, waving his arms. The waiters rushed in, carrying large serving platters, and set them on a table in front of the king. When he lifted the covers, shafts of brilliant colored light leaped from the plates and bounced around the ceiling, the walls, across the floor, and out the window. "Not a very substantial meal," said the humbug, rubbing his eyes, "but a quite attractive one. Perhaps you could suggest something a little more filling." Can you figure out what Milo asked for? The king clapped his hands. The platters were removed, and without thinking, Milo quickly suggested, "Well, in that case, I think we ought to have a square meal of—" "A square meal it is!" shouted the humbug again. The king clapped his hands once more, and the waiters reappeared carrying plates heaped high with steaming squares of all sizes and colors. "Ah," said the spelling bee, tasting one. "These are awful." No one else seemed to like them very much, and the humbug got one caught in his throat and almost choked. "Time for speeches," announced the king as the plates were again removed and everyone looked glum. "You first," he commanded, pointing to Milo. "Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen," started Milo timidly, "I would like to take this opportunity to say that in all the—" "That's quite enough," snapped the king. "Mustn't talk all day." "But I'd just begun," objected Milo. "Next!" bellowed the king. "Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, vanilla ice cream," recited the humbug, bouncing up and down. What a strange speech, thought Milo, for he'd heard many in the past and knew that they were supposed to be long and dull. "Hamburgers, corn on the cob, chocolate pudding, pudding," said the spelling bee in turn. "Frankfurters, sour pickles, strawberry jam," shouted Officer Shrift from his chair. Since he was taller sitting than standing, he didn't even bother getting up. And so down the line it went, with each guest rising briefly, making a short speech, and then resuming his place. When everyone had finished, the king rose. "Pâté, foie gras, soup, faisan, sous cloche, salad endive, fromage fruits et dématasse," he said carefully, and clapped his hands again. The waiters reappeared immediately, carrying heavy hot trays, which they set on the table. Each one contained the exact words spoken by the various guests, and they all began eating immediately with great gusto. "Dig in," said the king, poking Milo with his elbow, and looked disapprovingly at his plate. "I can't say that I think much of your choice." "I didn't know that I was going to have to eat my words," objected Milo. Of course, everyone here does," the king grunted. "You should have made a tastier speech." Milo looked around at everyone busily stuffing himself, and then back at his own unappetizing plate. Certainly didn't look worth eating, and he was so very hungry. "Here, try some somersault," suggested the Duke. "It provides the flavor." "Have a rigmarole," offered the Count, passing the bread basket. "Or a ragamuffin," seconded the minister. "Perhaps you'd care for a synonym bun," suggested the Duke. "Why not wait for your just desserts?" mumbled the Earl indistinctly, his mouth full of food. "How many times must I tell you not to bite off more than you can chew?" snapped the undersecretary, patting the distressed Earl on his back. "In one ear and out the other," scolded the Duke, attempting to stuff one of his words through the Earl's head. "If it isn't one thing, it's another," chided the minister. "Out of the frying pan into the fire," shouted the Count, burning himself badly. "Well, you don't have to bite my head off," screamed the terrified Earl, and flew at the others in rage. The five of them scuffled wildly around the table. "Stop that at once," thundered Azaz, "or I'll banish the lot of you." "Sorry, excuse me, forgive us, pardon, regrets." They apologized in turn and sat down, glaring at each other. The rest of the meal was finished in silence until the king, wiping the gravy stains from his vest, called for dessert. Milo, who hadn't eaten anything, looked up eagerly. "We're having a special treat today," said the king, as the delicious smell of homemade pastry filled the banquet hall. "By royal command, the pastry chefs have worked all night in the half-bakery to make sure that—" "The half-bakery?" questioned Milo. "Well, of course the half-bakery," snapped the king. "Where do you think half-baked ideas come from? Now, please don't interrupt. By royal command, the pastry chefs have worked all night to—" "What's a half-baked idea?" asked Milo again. "Will you be quiet?" growled King Azaz angrily. But before he could begin again, 3 large serving carts were wheeled into the hall, and everyone jumped up to help himself. "They're very tasty," explained the humbug, "but they don't always agree with you. Here's one that's very good." He handed it to Milo, and through the icing and nuts, Milo saw that it said, "The earth is flat." "People swallowed that one for years," commented the spelling bee, "but it's not very popular these days, DAYS. He picked up a long one that stated, "The moon is made of green cheese," and hungrily bit off the part that said cheese. "Now there's a half-baked idea," he said, smiling. Milo looked at the great assortment of cakes, which were being eaten almost as quickly as anyone could read them. The Count was munching contentedly on "It never rains, but it pours," and the king was busy slicing one that stated, "Night air is bad air." "I wouldn't eat too many of those if I were you," advised Tok. "They may look good, but you can get terribly sick." "Don't worry," replied Milo. "I'll just wrap one up for later." And he folded his napkin around. Everything happens for the best. And that is the end of chapter 8. Can you figure out what a half-baked idea is? That is all for today. Have a wonderful day. Keep reading. Go outside. Do something outside. Make a fort or go outside and say hi to the birds. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.